the untrained eye, a quiet town might seem like the perfect getaway, a place where the pace of life slows and the world feels safe and predictable. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, a place like this can give you the impression that nothing ever goes wrong. But within those cozy cottages, beneath the smiles exchanged at the local diner, can lurk something far more sinister. Some towns carry burdens heavier than their picturesque facades suggest, hiding dark secrets nearly forgotten by those who still remember. And if a secret is dark enough, it can grow, fester, and even spawn something worse. A curse that no one can escape. Tonight's tale revolves around one such curse, born from an unspeakable evil that the townspeople buried long ago, hoping to keep their town's idyllic image intact. The truth was left to rot, locked away in old town records and whispered stories. But curses have a way of resurfacing, and in the most horrific way possible. The town was small, hidden away from the rest of the world. A place where time seemed to stop, where people whispered less about their past and more about what was for dinner that night. It was the kind of place where every face felt familiar, where strangers stood out like stains on an otherwise pristine fabric. And that's why he stood out so much. The newcomer, the hunter. He was an outsider in every sense. He moved there with his dog, a loyal, aging companion who had been with him for years. The two of them had seen it all. Lonely stretches of wilderness, snowy mountain peaks, vast forests. So this quiet town should have been a change of pace, a welcome escape from the noise of the world. It seemed like a peaceful place to settle down. The locals were polite but distant, their greetings shallow and mechanical. He didn't mind. He wasn't looking for friends, just a place to finally relax. There was something about the town, though. A feeling crept in during the quiet moments when the streets were empty and the sun started to sink below the horizon. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on. Just a sensation, like the air itself was watching him. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the way the trees crowded in on the edge of town, their branches casting long shadows that twisted and stretched like skeletal fingers. One afternoon, as he was walking his dog down one of the narrow streets, they passed by a yard sale. Tables full of old furniture, books, and knickknacks were scattered across a front lawn, a small group of townspeople milling about. It was the usual stuff, nothing worth stopping for. But his dog froze. It stopped dead in its tracks, eyes fixed on something nestled in the clutter. He followed the dog's gaze and saw it. A small, tattered toy. A stuffed animal, ragged and worn from years of neglect. It was strange how fixated the dog became. The animal whined softly, pawing at the ground, its tail wagging with a kind of desperation he hadn't seen before. He hesitated for a moment, but shrugged it off. The dog wanted the toy, and why not? Maybe it reminded it of something, maybe it just needed a new distraction. Without much thought, he walked over, picked up the toy, and handed the old woman running the sale $1. She barely acknowledged him, just nodded as if she couldn't care less. He stuffed the toy in his coat pocket, and they continued on their way. He didn't think about the toy again until later that evening. After dinner, he tossed it on the floor for the dog to play with. Almost immediately, the dog was on it, gripping it between its teeth with an unsettling intensity. It didn't just play with the toy, it possessed it. At first, he thought nothing of it. Animals get attached to objects all the time. But as the days passed, the dog's behavior grew stranger. It never let the toy out of its sight, carried it everywhere, and even slept with it under its paw. If anyone, including him, came near the toy, the dog would growl a low, threatening rumble that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. And then there was the night. The first night he heard the noises. It was around midnight, and the house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. He was dozing off when he heard a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. He sat up, straining to hear more. It came again, a slow, deliberate scratching. He thought it might be the dog, but when he looked, the dog was fast asleep at the foot of his bed, the toy clutched tightly between its paws. The scratching continued for a few minutes, then stopped. He convinced himself it was nothing. Probably just the house settling or the wind against the windows. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Over the next week, the dog's behavior escalated. It stopped eating unless the toy was in the room. It barked at nothing, pacing in circles as if it could see something he couldn't. It would stare at walls for hours, its eyes unblinking, and growl at empty spaces. He tried taking the toy away once, just to see how the dog would react. The moment he touched it, the dog lunged at him, snapping its teeth inches from his hand. He pulled back, stunned. This was the same dog he had raised since it was a puppy. Loyal, gentle, never aggressive. But now it felt like he was looking at a different animal, something darker, something primal. By the second week, other things started happening. He began to notice small, strange things around the house. Objects moving slightly out of place, lights flickering for no reason, a chill in the air that had no source. At night, the scratching sounds returned, only now they were accompanied by whispers. Faint, almost unintelligible, like a distant conversation happening just out of earshot. He would get up, check the house, look out the windows, but there was never anything there. It wasn't just the house. Outside, in the woods surrounding the town, animals began to disappear. He would notice it during his hunts. Fewer tracks, fewer signs of life. The woods, which once seemed so full of energy, felt dead. The trees stood silent, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. He mentioned it to one of the locals, but they brushed it off, said it was probably just the change in the season. But he knew better. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just the woods, it was the dog. He could feel it every time the animal looked at him. Its once warm, trusting eyes were now cold, calculating. The toy never left its side, and the growling grew more frequent. Sometimes it felt like the growl wasn't even coming from the dog, but from something deeper, something inside it. The worst part was the dreams. Every night they came. Dark, vivid nightmares of the dog standing over him, its eyes glowing in the dim light of the room, its mouth open in a silent snarl. In the dream, it wasn't his dog anymore. It was something else, something with a purpose he couldn't understand. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the dog still at the foot of his bed, the toy between its paws, watching him with those cold, unblinking eyes. He began avoiding the dog. It felt wrong, but he couldn't help it. The animal made him uneasy, and the constant presence of the toy was starting to gnaw at his sanity. The whispers were louder now, no longer just in the dead of night, but creeping into the edges of his waking hours. He could almost make out words, but every time he tried to focus on them, they slipped away like smoke. Then, the first person went missing. It was a neighbor, someone he barely knew. They lived a few houses down, a quiet, older man who kept to himself. One day he was there, the next he was gone. The town didn't make much of it at first. People leave all the time, right? But then another person went missing, and another. The disappearances were sudden, and the town, small and close-knit as it was, began to panic. Whispers turned to gossip, gossip turned to accusations, and all eyes turned to the outsider, to the hunter. The new guy in town, the one who was always out in the woods, the one with the aggressive dog. He didn't know how it had escalated so quickly, but soon enough, people were pointing fingers. No one said it directly to his face, but he could feel it in the way they looked at him, the way they crossed the street when he walked by, the way they stopped talking the moment he entered a room. He did his best to keep to himself, but the pressure was impossible to ignore. Something was wrong. He could feel it in every tense moment he spent in that house, every cold glance the townspeople threw his way. But how could he explain it? Even he wasn't sure what was happening. The dog was changing, that much he knew, but what could he tell them? The disappearances weighed heavily on him, like a puzzle he couldn't solve. The strange behavior of the dog, the eerie sounds in the night, the way the town seemed to close in around him. It was all connected, he was sure of it. But certainty didn't bring any comfort. Instead, it left him spiraling, unable to grasp how everything had gone so wrong so fast. The dog, the missing people, the whispers. What did it all mean? The strange part was that even he wasn't sure what to believe. There was something wrong, something horribly off, and it seemed like he was the only one feeling it. The dog had changed, that much he couldn't deny. It wasn't the same loyal companion it once was. The way it watched him now, its eyes following his every movement like it was waiting for something, disturbed him more than he could admit. The toy never left its side. The toy went wherever the dog went, always clutched between its jaws or resting under its paws. The growling had become more frequent, low and guttural, as if something inside the dog was simmering just beneath the surface. He had tried to ignore it at first. He had tried to tell himself it was just the stress of the move, that the dog was simply acting out. But this was different. The dog was different. It wasn't just aggression. It was something deeper, something darker. He began keeping his distance, even though it felt wrong. He had raised this dog since it was a pup, and now he could barely recognize it. He tried to keep the toy away, but the reaction had been immediate. The dog became violent, almost rabid, and he had been forced to give it back. That was when he started locking his bedroom door at night. The strange sounds continued. The scratching had gotten louder, more insistent, like something was clawing at the walls, trying to get in. And the whispers, those soft, insidious whispers, seemed to echo through the house, no matter where he was. He could never quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were words of malice, of warning, always just beyond his understanding. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers filling his ears, and the dog would be there, at the foot of the bed, watching him. The disappearances had put the town on edge, but they had pushed him into a deeper kind of fear. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the fact that people were vanishing, or the growing realization that his dog was somehow connected to it. He didn't want to believe it, but every instinct told him something terrible was happening, and it was happening right under his nose. The tracks he found in the woods were large, far larger than they should have been. He had followed them once, deep into the forest, but they had disappeared near an old, crumbling stone wall, the kind that had been abandoned for decades. He hadn't gone any further. The forest itself had changed too. It was quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife had been replaced with an unnatural stillness, like the very trees were holding their breath. He didn't see the usual signs of deer or small animals anymore. The woods felt dead, lifeless, and every time he went out there, it felt like he wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, more oppressive. It was as if the forest itself had turned against him. But the town's suspicion of him was worse. The rumors had spread quickly, as they often do in small places. People began avoiding him, crossing the street when they saw him coming, or turning their backs when he entered a room. They whispered behind his back, their eyes hard with judgment. It was clear that they believed he was responsible for the disappearances, though no one dared confront him directly. They blamed him for bringing something dark into their peaceful world. And maybe, on some level, they were right. He couldn't sleep anymore. Every night was the same. A few hours of restless tossing, followed by waking to the whispers and the scratching. The dog would sit outside his door, sometimes pacing, sometimes just sitting, breathing heavily, as if waiting. The tension was unbearable, and it was driving him to the edge of sanity. His once peaceful life had turned into a nightmare, and there was no way out. The dog was growing. That was something he couldn't deny anymore. He had noticed it first when the dog's collar had begun to fit tighter, but now it was more obvious. The dog had grown larger, its muscles more defined, its presence more intimidating. He could feel the change in the air when the dog was near, like the temperature dropped just slightly. The growling had become deeper, more feral. It was no longer a pet, it was something else, something wrong. He began to wonder if the dog was leaving at night, if it was responsible for the missing people. But how could he explain that to anyone? No one would believe him. Even he didn't want to believe it. But the thought gnawed at him, kept him awake at night. He had started leaving the house less, avoiding the town as much as possible. He couldn't stand the way they looked at him, the way they avoided him. He didn't belong there, and he knew it. But leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. One night, the scratching stopped. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was thick, suffocating, like the quiet before a storm. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. The whispers had stopped too, and that was the most unsettling part. He had grown used to them, in a way, and their absence felt wrong. The dog wasn't outside his door. He could feel the emptiness in the space where it usually sat, its heavy breathing gone. He got up, quietly opening the door and stepping into the hallway. The house was dark, but he could see enough. The dog wasn't there. It wasn't in the house at all. Panic surged through him. He grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, his breath catching in his throat as he stepped into the cold night air. The forest loomed in front of him, the trees standing tall and silent like sentinels. The trail was easy to follow. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, the heavy prints of a large animal pressed into the dirt. He followed them, his heart pounding in his chest. The deeper he went, the more he realized he wasn't just following his dog. He was following something else, something darker. He reached the clearing just before dawn. The air was still, the silence oppressive. And there, at the edge of the clearing, he saw it, his dog standing over something, a body. He froze, the flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. The dog was larger than it had ever been, its fur standing on end, its eyes glowing in the dim light of the early morning. The body beneath it was motionless, lifeless. For a long time, he just stood there, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. The dog looked up at him, its eyes locking onto his. There was something behind those eyes, something not of this world. It wasn't his dog anymore. It was something else entirely, something monstrous. He backed away, the fear clawing at his throat. His dog had done this. The missing people, the strange behavior, the whispers. It had all led to this. He didn't know how, but the toy had something to do with it. The cursed object that had come into his life so innocuously had changed everything. He was too afraid to get closer, too afraid to confront the creature that had once been his companion. As the sun began to rise, the dog slowly turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving the body and the toy behind. He didn't follow. He couldn't. Instead, he stumbled back to the house, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. When he returned to town later that day, he heard the news. Another person had gone missing. They didn't find the body, but he knew where it was. And the town, once again, turned its gaze on him. The suspicion had become a certainty in their eyes. He was the outsider, the one responsible for the disappearances. They didn't say it outright, but he could feel it in every glance, in every whisper that followed him as he walked the streets. There was no escaping it now. He had become the enemy. The hunter had become the hunted, and the town was ready to cast him out. But it wasn't the townspeople he was afraid of. It was the dog, the creature that lurked in the woods, growing stronger with every passing night. The creature that had once been his friend, but was now something much, much worse. He knew he couldn't stay. The town wouldn't let him, and the dog wouldn't stop. The curse had taken hold, and there was no breaking it. The only question that remained was whether he would be next. The dog would come for him eventually, and when it did, he wasn't sure if he would have the strength to stop it. There was no peace after that night. No silence, no moment of calm. Each passing hour felt heavier than the last, the weight of the toy's curse sinking deeper into him. The dog was gone, but the town wasn't safe. The air itself felt poisoned, like a thick fog had settled in, pressing against his chest. Something dark had taken hold, something far worse than the cold stares from the townspeople. But still, he couldn't leave. He had to know what was really happening. He had to understand. The disappearances continued. Every few days, another face was missing from town. Every few days, another rumor spread, and the fingers pointed toward him. He was no longer just an outsider. He was a threat. The locals grew more distant, more hostile, but they weren't saying anything to his face. That wasn't how small towns worked. Instead, they whispered behind closed doors, gossip spreading like wildfire, stoked by fear and suspicion. The police questioned him, but there was nothing they could do. He hadn't done anything, at least not that they could prove. Yet they kept watching, waiting. He couldn't stand the isolation anymore. Staying inside, listening to the whispers that only grew louder in his head. It was suffocating. So, he decided to start looking for answers, to understand the strange events that had spiraled out of control since the day he picked up the cursed toy. Something had brought this darkness into his life, and it all seemed to lead back to that object. It began with small conversations. He tried speaking to the older folks around town, those who had lived through the decades and might remember what others had long forgotten. But no one wanted to talk. The moment he mentioned the dog or the strange toy, their eyes would narrow and they'd clam up. It was as if the subject was cursed too, like even acknowledging it was inviting something darker into their lives. Despite the cold reception, a few cryptic pieces of information slipped through. A name came up more than once. Someone who had lived in the town long ago, a man with a reputation that no one wanted to revisit. It took time, but he finally managed to find out more through whispers and stories barely shared above a murmur. The name was old and linked to a killer. Not just any killer, but one who had left his mark on the town in the worst way possible. Years ago, long before the disappearances started, a string of murders plagued the area. Women and children were the ones taken. There were no patterns to the killings, no clear motive other than cruelty. And with each body, the killer left a calling card, a toy. A small, insignificant object that seemed harmless at first glance, but it became a symbol of something much darker. The connection between the toy and the killer gnawed at him. It was too much of a coincidence. The toy he had picked up, the one his dog had become obsessed with, had the same eerie significance as those the killer used to leave behind. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they formed an ugly picture, one that he couldn't turn away from. The town had buried the killer's legacy deep, like a festering wound they didn't want the world to know about. But now that wound was open again. He began to frequent the library, digging through old newspapers and public records. The town's history was darker than he ever imagined. The killer had operated in secret for years, terrorizing the town until one day, the murders just stopped. No one ever knew why. The killer was never caught, and the town, desperate to move on, swept the whole story under the rug. It was as if pretending it had never happened would erase the fear, the grief. But curses don't just fade away. Evil like that lingers, hiding in plain sight, waiting to be found. As he pieced the puzzle together, the disappearances began to make more sense, though it terrified him to admit it. The town was being punished, not for what it had done, but for what it had tried to forget. The killer's legacy, the toy, the curse. It was all connected. It wasn't just the history that terrified him. The curse was alive and it moved through the town like a sickness, infecting everything it touched. The curse had latched onto him, onto the town itself, and now it was feeding off the fear and tension that grew with every disappearance. The more people vanished, the more the town turned against him. Even though he was innocent, all they knew was that ever since he showed up, their quiet, peaceful world had fallen apart. He hadn't slept in days. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his mind, no matter where he went. It was as if the curse had seeped into every corner of his life, suffocating him, drowning him in fear and doubt. He tried to sleep, tried to ignore the sounds, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dog standing over him, its eyes empty and cold. The toy was still in the house, hidden away, but it didn't matter. The curse had taken root long before he tried to hide it. As the disappearances mounted, he realized the town was running out of time. Whatever darkness had been stirred by the toy, by the history he had uncovered, was growing stronger. The town's fear was feeding it, giving it life. And he was at the center of it all. He couldn't leave, even if he wanted to. The curse wouldn't let him. One night, as he lay awake, unable to sleep, he heard something outside his window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A sound, soft but insistent, like footsteps moving through the grass. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to know what was out there, but the fear had become too much, and curiosity won out. Slowly, he got out of bed and moved toward the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled back the curtain, just a crack, enough to see outside. The yard was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, hiding just beyond his line of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. He stepped back, closing the curtain and trying to steady his breathing, but the fear didn't leave him. It had become a permanent part of him now, just like the curse. The next day, he made one final attempt to find answers. He went to the oldest part of town, to the people who had lived there long before he had arrived. He didn't expect much, but desperation pushed him forward. He knocked on doors, spoke to anyone who would listen, but most refused to talk. They knew something, he was sure of it, but fear kept their lips sealed. No one wanted to revisit the past, to acknowledge the truth that had been buried for so long. But finally someone talked. An old woman, her hands shaking as she spoke, told him about the killer. She remembered the fear that had gripped the town back then, the way people had lived in terror for years, waiting for the next body to be found. She remembered the toys, the ones left at every scene, and she remembered the day it all stopped, the day the killer vanished without a trace. She didn't know why it had stopped, or where the killer had gone, but she had her suspicions. The town had always been a strange place, full of secrets, and she believed that the evil had never really left. It had just gone dormant, waiting for someone to bring it back. And now it was back. He thanked her and left, but her words haunted him. The evil had never left. The toy had never left. And now it was feeding off the town once again. After speaking with the old woman, the weight of everything started to crush him. The pieces of the past had formed an ugly picture, but now he was part of it. But none of that mattered to the town. They had already decided he was the cause of it all. There was no explaining it to them. They were ready to turn on him, and no one was going to listen. The next morning, there were more whispers and another person had gone missing. He didn't bother trying to find out who it was. It didn't matter anymore. The town was already at its breaking point, and each new disappearance only pushed them closer to the edge. They weren't looking for explanations anymore. They just wanted someone to blame, and he was the only target left. His house was marked. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him, filled with quiet accusation. He was walking on a thread, and it was only a matter of time before it snapped. The toy was still there, in the drawer, hidden away but never far from his thoughts. It had started everything, hadn't it? But the old woman had said something else, something that made him realize the toy wasn't just an object. It was a link to the evil that had stained this town long before he ever arrived. The toy had been dormant, waiting for someone to find it. The whispers were louder now, like a steady hum in his mind, growing more insistent with each passing day. He had started hearing them even when he was out in the town, echoing through his thoughts like a voice he couldn't shut off. They never made sense, just fragments of something darker, something that gnawed at him from the inside. Sometimes he thought he could hear his name buried in those whispers, like the town itself was calling to him, pulling him deeper into the curse. He couldn't stay in the house anymore. The silence, the feeling of being watched, it was unbearable. The walls were closing in, and the whispers had become too much to bear. Every corner of the house felt wrong, as if something was waiting in the dark, just out of sight, ready to strike. He spent hours pacing, unable to sit still, unable to focus. The toy's presence hung over him, even when he wasn't near it, like a shadow he couldn't escape. The disappearances continued, and the town grew more aggressive. The whispers weren't just in his mind anymore. He could hear them in the streets, see them in the way people looked at him. They didn't bother hiding their suspicion now. Wherever he went, there were stares, sharp glances from windows, the murmurs of strangers talking behind his back. The hostility was palpable. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was the enemy. It wasn't long before someone made their move. One night, he returned to find the door of his house broken, the lock shattered. Whoever had done it wasn't looking for anything. They didn't want his belongings. They wanted to send a message. Inside, everything was overturned, ripped apart. Furniture smashed, books thrown across the floor, dishes shattered. But the worst part was the writing on the walls. It was everywhere, scrawled in large, red letters. Murderer. Leave. There was no subtlety left. They weren't just whispering anymore. The town had spoken, and they wanted him gone. He stood in the wreckage of his home, feeling the weight of the words pressing down on him. The whispers in his mind mixed with the words on the walls, growing louder, until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run far away, to escape the nightmare that had swallowed his life. But he couldn't. The toy, the curse, it had its claws in him, and there was no escaping it. As the days went by, the tension in the air grew thicker. The disappearances continued, but now the town's attention was fixed solely on him. They didn't care about the truth anymore. They just wanted him gone, and the whispers were no longer whispers. There were shouts and angry accusations that followed him wherever he went. He didn't leave the house unless he had to. When he did, he could feel the weight of their eyes on him, watching his every move. One night, the whispers in his head grew so loud that he thought he might lose his mind. He had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. The scratching sounds had returned, moving through the walls, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. He knew it wasn't the dog. The dog was gone, but something else had taken its place. In the darkness, the toy called to him. He could feel it, pulling at the edges of his mind, dragging him deeper into the nightmare. He got out of bed, his body moving on its own, drawn toward the drawer where he had hidden it. His hands shook as he opened the drawer, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The toy was there, sitting on top of his clothes, exactly where he had left it. But now it felt alive, like it was waiting for him to pick it up. He slammed the drawer shut, backing away from it, but the feeling didn't go away. The whispers were louder than ever, filling the room, filling his head. The air seemed to ripple with the weight of the curse, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He couldn't stay in the house any longer. He needed to get out, to escape, to clear his mind. He ran outside, the cold night air hitting him like a wave. For a moment, it was a relief, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed him into the street, echoing through his mind, dragging him deeper into the darkness. The streets were empty, as they always were now. No one left their houses after dark anymore. The town was afraid, locked inside their homes, hiding from the nightmare that had consumed them. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked, his feet carrying him through the empty streets, past the houses with their dark windows and locked doors. The town was asleep, but the curse was wide awake, feeding off the fear, the tension, the anger. The closer he got to the edge of town, the louder the whispers became, until they were almost unbearable. Then he saw it. The old stone wall. The one he had seen before, the one where the tracks had disappeared into the forest. It was overgrown, half forgotten, like so much of the town's history, but now it felt different, like it was calling to him. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the wall. The whispers in his head were louder now, a constant roar that drowned out everything else. He took a step toward the wall, then another. His legs felt heavy, like they were moving through water, but he couldn't stop. The air around him seemed to grow colder with each step, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. He knew he shouldn't be here. He knew that whatever waited for him behind that wall wasn't something he wanted to find. But it didn't matter. He had come too far. The toy, the disappearances, the town's buried secrets. It was all leading him here. He climbed over the wall, the stones rough and cold under his hands. The forest beyond was silent, the trees standing tall and still, like they guarding something ancient and forgotten. The ground was covered in leaves, but there was something else too, something darker. He could feel it under his feet, shifting just beneath the surface, like the earth itself was alive. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around him like a storm. He could barely think, barely breathe, as he walked deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting like claws, reaching out to pull him under. But he kept walking, his feet moving on their own, driven by something he couldn't control. He didn't know how long he walked. Time had lost all meaning. The forest stretched on forever, a maze of shadows and darkness that seemed to have no end. But finally he reached the clearing. It was small, barely more than a patch of earth surrounded by trees, but it felt wrong. The air was thick with something heavy, something dark. In the center of the clearing was a stone, old and weathered, covered in moss. And on top of it, sitting like it had been waiting for him all along, was the toy. He couldn't breathe. The whispers were everywhere now, inside him, around him, pulling him deeper into the curse. The toy sat there, silent and still, but he could feel its presence, its power. The weight of everything crashed down on him all at once. The town, the disappearances, the curse. They had all been leading him here. And now, there was no turning back. The clearing felt like a place that time had forgotten, a spot untouched by anything living, as if the ground itself had been waiting for this moment. The toy sat on the stone in front of him, silent and still, but heavy with the curse that had taken over his life. The whispers in his head were no longer just whispers. They were a roar, a sound that filled the air, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The pressure was unbearable, crushing his thoughts and suffocating his breath. The air was thick, too thick to breathe, and the darkness around him felt alive, pulsing with something he couldn't understand. He stared at the toy, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that this was it. This was where everything had led him, and now, here in this forgotten place, he knew there was no turning back. The toy had called him here for a reason, and he wasn't leaving until it was over. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, almost like it was breathing, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. He took a step closer to the stone, his hands shaking, his legs heavy with fear. The whispers were louder now, clearer, almost like voices, but not quite. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew they were speaking to him, pulling him closer to the cursed object that had brought this nightmare into his life. As he stood there, staring at the toy, something moved in the trees. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, his heart racing. The air around him felt electric, charged with something dark and terrible. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was lurking just beyond the tree line, but he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes scanning the shadows. The dog. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form barely visible in the darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its fur was matted and wild, like it had been running through the woods for days. It didn't move or growl. It just watched him, its presence heavy and suffocating. The same dog that had once been his loyal companion was now something else, something darker, something twisted by the curse. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt thick, almost solid, as if the space was filled with something unspoken, something that had been building ever since he found the cursed toy. The dog's eyes locked onto his, and in that instant he knew. This wasn't the dog anymore. It hadn't been the dog for a long time. It was something else, something born from the curse that had consumed the town, that had consumed him. And now, it was here to finish what had been started all those years ago. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The air felt colder, biting into his skin, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. The dog took a step forward, its eyes never leaving his. There was no aggression in its movements, just the slow, deliberate pace of something that knew exactly what it was doing. The dog was no longer a mindless beast. It had a purpose, and that purpose was standing right in front of him. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body frozen in place by fear. The whispers in his head were deafening now, screaming at him, telling him to run, to move, to do anything but stand there. But he couldn't. The dog was coming closer, its steps slow and methodical, like it was taking its time, savoring the moment. As the dog approached, the air grew heavier, the pressure building until it felt like his chest might cave in. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his ears. The dog stopped just a few feet away, its eyes boring into his, and for a moment he thought he saw something familiar, something that reminded him of the dog he had once known. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the cold, empty stare. The toy was still on the stone, sitting there like a relic of something forgotten, something ancient and malevolent. He glanced at it, the fear gnawing at his insides, but he couldn't bring himself to move toward it. His hands shook as he took a step back, his heart racing. The dog didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, its presence heavy and oppressive. The whispers were louder than ever, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He knew what he had to do. His mind raced, his thoughts tangled in fear and confusion. But somewhere in the chaos, a single thought broke through. The dog had to die. It was the only way. The toy, the curse, the town's dark history. It all led back to the dog. It had been twisted, consumed by the evil that had haunted this place for so long. And now, the only way to stop it was to put an end to the dog once and for all. But he couldn't do it. His hands trembled, his legs felt weak, and the fear clawed at his insides, making it impossible to move. The dog was still his dog, wasn't it? Somewhere in there, beneath the curse, beneath the darkness, was the animal he had raised. But as he stood there, staring into the dog's cold, empty eyes, he realized the truth. The dog was gone. Whatever had been there before was gone, and now there was only the curse. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he reached into his jacket, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold steel of the hunting knife. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, the fear twisting his stomach into knots. The dog didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, its eyes never leaving his. He raised the knife, his hands shaking, his mind screaming at him to stop. But he couldn't stop. The curse had taken everything from him, and now it was about to take the last piece of his soul. He stepped closer, the weight of the knife heavy in his hand, the whispers in his head louder than ever. The dog didn't fight. It didn't growl, didn't lunge. It just stood there, waiting, as if it knew what was coming. And in that moment, as he raised the knife, he saw it. The flicker of recognition, the brief flash of the dog he had once known. The creature whimpered, a sound so soft and broken that it nearly stopped him in his tracks. For a split second, the dog wasn't a monster. It was his dog again, the one he had loved, the one that had been by his side through everything. But it was only a moment. With a final, desperate cry, he brought the knife down. The blade sank into the dog's flesh, and for a second, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the pressure lifted, and the air grew still. The dog crumpled to the ground, its body limp and lifeless, and the darkness that had filled the clearing seemed to retreat, fading into the shadows like a memory. He stood there, the knife still clutched in his hand, his body trembling. The dog was dead. The curse, the evil that had haunted him for so long, was gone. But the relief he had expected never came. Instead, there was only emptiness. The town's dark history, the disappearances, the curse. They had taken everything from him. And now, standing over the lifeless body of the dog that had once been his friend, he realized that there was nothing left for him here. The whispers were gone. The curse was over, but the damage had been done. The next morning, he buried the dog deep in the woods, under the twisted branches and cold soil. There was no ceremony, no goodbye, just the dull thud of earth covering the only friend he had left. When it was done, he stood there for a moment, staring at the grave, waiting to feel something. But there was nothing, just a hollow ache where his heart used to be. The town didn't say a word when he packed his things and left. They watched from their windows, silent and cold, as he loaded his truck. They didn't need to tell him to go. The message had been clear from the start. He didn't belong there. The house sat empty as he pulled away, the road stretching out in front of him like an escape route from a nightmare he'd never wake up from. The toy was gone, buried with the dog, but its weight followed him, clinging to his thoughts, a shadow he'd never outrun. He knew the town would move on. They always did. They would pretend none of it ever happened, just like before. He never looked back. Not once. Even as the forest faded behind him, even as the mountains shrank into the horizon, he kept driving. The road stretched on, endless and empty, but the curse lingered, buried deep in the place where no one dared to look. The toy, the curse, the dog, it was all over. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was just absence, an absence that echoed in every corner of his soul. And no matter how far he drove, he knew one thing for certain. Some things stay buried, but they never really die. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. If you'd like to support the channel and get exclusive content, consider joining my Patreon. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching.